Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Thank you. And we, of course, are not doing the easiest part of Torah, not necessarily from an intellectual standpoint, although one could say that, I suppose, but from an emotional standpoint, because these are all punishments. At least that's the tribulations, that's for sure, right? Anyway, here we go. Talking about, curse upon curse upon curse. B'shivri lachem matei lechem. When I break, in other words, this is Bayad Oyev means, this is the previous verse, that they'll be put into the hands of the enemy. When I break for you the staff of bread. So, in other words, basically, they're going to face starvation, right? Va'afu eser nashim, and 10 women will bake lachmechem, your bread, betanur echad, in one oven. Veheshivu lachmechem b'mishkal, and they will distribute the bread according to weight. V'achaltem, and you shall eat. V'lo tisba'u, but you won't be satisfied. So, matelechem, right, the staff of bread. So he says, what's the business of the staff? What metaphor does that represent? He says, Lashon Mish'an. It has the connotation of a support, right? That bread supports us, right? So Kamo, he gives an example from Jeremiah chapter 8. Actually, it's Jeremiah chapter 48, apparently. And it says, Mate Oz, and the whole verse just simply means the staff of strength, but the whole phrase is, alas, the sword of my, shouldn't be sword, that absolutely should be staff. I must have had a spell correct or something there, of my strength is broken. Okay, V'shivri lachem matelechem, when I break for you your staff, the staff of bread. Ishbor lachem, right, I will break for you, not as a favor, right? Kol misad ochel, any support of food. Vehem chitze ra'av, and this is described elsewhere as the arrows of famine or the arrows of starvation, of hunger. Va'afu eser nashim lachmechem betanur echad, and 10 women will bake your bread in one oven. Mechoser eitzim. Why? Because there isn't enough fuel, there isn't enough wood to kindle the stove and to keep it hot. So they have to share the oven. Veheshivu lachmachem b'mishchal, and they will distribute your bread according to weight. Shetehei hatvuah near kevet, because the produce rots. V'ne'esei pat nefula, and the what produce you can rescue becomes crumbly bread, fallen bread that's falling. Umishtaberet batanur, and it breaks in the oven, crumbles up in the oven. Vehein yoshvot, and the women, I believe yoshvot would be, they would sit, veshoklot et hashvarim, and they measure these crumbles, these broken parts of it, lechalacham lechalkam beinehem, in order to distribute it amongst them. V'achaltem v'lo tispa'u, and you shall eat but not be satisfied. Ze me'era betoch hame'ayim belechem. This is a curse in your innards regarding the bread. And so as a result, hare sheva pur'aniyot. So we can count out 7 types of tribulation. Cherev, the sword, matzor, siege, dever, pestilence, shever pate lechem, the staff of bread is broken, choser eitzim, because of the 10 women with one oven, the lack of wood, pat nefola, crumbly bread, or bread that isn't. I'm trying to think what it's mildewed or something like that, perhaps. Me'eraba in mayim, b'me'ayim, and also a curse in one's innards. Unetatem eina, and there's a part where it says a little earlier on, I shall give you, where it says, Venitatem biyad ha'oyev, I'll place you in the hands of the enemy. And he says, min minyan, eina min minyan, that is not part of the counting of the specification, shehi hacherev, because that refers to the cherev, it refers to the sword. Going on, a few verses without Rashi. Ve'im bezot lo tishma'uli, and if with this you don't hearken to me, you don't pay attention to me, v'alachtem imi bakeri, and you go with me in this casual kind of way, that yeah, just happen to think of you, happen to consider the divine, not really consider it seriously, be mindful about it. And I will go with you. It isn't just that we can let go on our side. There is an agreement here, and God is going to respond on God's part, right, on his part. So chamat keri, chema generally means fury, right? With fury. Vayisarti etchem af ani, and even I, will bring tribulations upon you, or I will punish you. Sheva al chatotechem, sevenfold of over your sins, or because on account of your sins. V'achaltem b'sar einechem. This is a terrible, terrible verse. If you take it literally, it says, "And you shall consume the flesh of your sons, u'b'sar benotechem tochelu, and you will eat the flesh of your daughters." Wow. There is no Rashi on this. Just really very, very dark and awful. V'hishmadati et bamotechem, and I will destroy your high places. V'hichrati et chamanechem, and I will cut off your sun images, would be the Rashi. We can take a look from chama, meaning sun. V'natati et pigrechem, and I shall place your corpses al pigre gilulechem, on the corpses of your idols. V'ga'ala nafshi etchem, and I will loathe you. Tough. B'motechem. Sorry, b'motechem. These are the first part of that curse. It says, Migdalim, towers, uviraniyot, and castles. Chamanechem, that's that word that we called sun images, something like this. Min avodat elilim, it's a kind of idol, shema'midin alagagot, which they would place on the roofs. V'al shem shema'midim b'chama, and because they set up in the light of the sun, in the sunlight, kruyim chamanim, they're called chamanim. V'natati et pigrechem, I shall place your corpses, tefuchei ra'av, swollen from famine, hayu, they would be, umotziim yiratam michekam, and they would take their idol from their bosom, uminashkam otam, and they would kiss these idols, the karso nivkad benofel aleha. So these are this graphic, forgive me, these graphic images, right? And it says basically his belly splits, breaks open, benofel aleha, and falls on this idol. V'ga'ala nafshi etchem, I think it is, right? And I will loathe you, ze siluk shchina. That would refer to the removal of the divine presence, that would be removed, and because God would not want to be close to us. V'natati et arechem horba, I shall make your cities a desolation. Hashimoti et mikdashchem, mikdashechem, and I will make desolate your sanctuaries. Velo ariach berech nichachem, and nor will I inhale the savor of your offerings, your presentations. Benatati et arechem korba, I shall turn your cities into rubble, essentially a ruin. Yachol me Adam. Perhaps when it says I will make your cities that way, it means that it's that the population is depopulated. So Keshehu Omer, so we don't mean here, he does not mean by desolation, etc., that it has to do with that it's desolate of people. Because there's another verse. Keshehu Omer Vashimoti Ani et haaretz, when it says I will bring destruction to the land. Hare Adam Amur. There it's referring to people. Ha ama ani mekayem chorva me'over v'shav. So what do I mean? What am I trying to say here where it talks about this ruin? It has to do with people coming by, passers-by. They won't be doing that anymore. Vashimoti et hamikdashechem, I will I will destroy your sanctuaries. Yachol min hakorbanot, maybe it means that he wouldn't allow them to bring sacrifices anymore. Keshehu omer velo ariach, when he says later on, I will not inhale the savor of your offerings. Hare korbanot amurim. So in that case, he's already talked about sacrifices. Hama ani mekayem vashimoti et mikdashechem. So what is this trying to tell us where it says, and I will destroy your sanctuaries? Min hagdudim. That refers to troops. Shayarot Shel Yisrael, that is the troops and caravans of Israelites, Shayu mitgadshot v'noadot liba lavosham, because they would sanctify themselves and then come upon Jerusalem to come there. They would appear to march to Jerusalem on the pilgrim festivals. That's not going to happen anymore. Hare Sheva Puraniot. So this is how we come to a total of 7 devastating acts or acts of punishment. Achilat basar panim ufanot, the consuming of the flesh of their sons and daughters, hashmadat pamot, and the destruction of these high places, haresh time, and there we have 2. Kritat chamanim, the cutting off of the sun worship here, ein kan purim, so ein kan Puraniyot ela al yedei hashmadat habiraniot. So he says, it looks to me, there is no tribulation unless he's saying he does not include the destruction of these chamanim. Ela al yedei, it is only by means of hashmadat habiraniot that would come about. Okay, so you can't count those sun images as a separate curse, destroying them, because what we're talking about, it's included in the destruction of the palaces or the towers, etc. Yiplu hachaminim shebarashe hagagot vayichretu. Because when those are destroyed, then of course the sun images will also, because they're up on the roof, they're going to be destroyed as well. V'natati et pigrechem v'gomer hare shalosh, and I shall set up your corpses, etc. This is for 3. Siluk shina arba, that the removal or withdrawal of the divine presence is 4. Korban arim, and the destruction of the villages, Shimamun Mikdash Min Hagdudiot. And he says that we're talking about the desolation of the sanctuary from these troops of people coming to bring their pilgrim offerings. V'lo ariach korbanot harei sheva, and I will no longer inhale the savor of your sacrifices. Here we have seven, a total of seven. And I would like to stop here today in terms of our second. Here we are. So let's stop here. I'm going to stop the share. Well, you're here, very silent, understandably
Well,
so. Please.
it sounds a lot like the Holocaust. You
Yeah,
know, waylaying Jewish cities and synagogues and, cannibalism and
right.
killing, Jewish people.
It,
And
mhm.
go ahead.
No, 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 please. I was interrupting you. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I this is my Torah portion, and I'm reading Haftorah and Maftir this week, and I'm supposed to give at least a brief introduction to the Haftorah, and I've been thinking about it because it mirrors this kind of stuff. But it seems to imply that like people don't really know what they're doing, and it talks about the deception of their heart, but God knows, and God would know that they don't completely know. I mean, they're living their lives according to what they think is right, and I know that they're not doing right, especially according to the strict and interpretation of what right is.
Yes.
But you can say that like the Holocaust can be, this could have been prophesying something like that, and this is, you know, a punishment for people who may have felt innocent but actually hadn't matched their hearts with what they knew inside to be right.
So yeah, no, 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 I hear you. Of course, there's this whole history of the Jewish people being thrown into exile and various times when they were really treated terribly. There's a thought that's entered my mind more recently, which is that in sensing the divine, what goes into the world, and the thing that really, I think, something that I've been able to perhaps understand better than I ever have before in my life is this notion of transcendence. In other words, to realize that there's nothing, nothing at all that happens from the tiniest microbe to the ability, to galaxies, etc. And our own functions, our own brain functions, and maybe it's all just a sign of getting older, where you can no longer take for granted the ability of the body to function in an efficient kind of way, but to recognize that behind all these things is a divine presence. That were it not for that divine presence that underscores and makes possible the natural, we can analyze as accurately as possible, and in a very sophisticated way, all these natural processes. We can split the atom, all those things. But the fact that there are atoms, quote, quote, the fact that human beings are given the brain power to do this, all these things actually depend on this divine presence. And in contrast to that is the level of which people just have no appreciation, no sense of that. And there is a certain level of betrayal involved in that. So I'm not even necessarily talking about performing mitzvahs. Performing mitzvahs is another element altogether. So I'm here just talking about the Adonai part of Adonai Eloheinu. So, I remember seeing these ads that talk about is it Our Lady of Guadalupe or something? It's a saint of Guadalupe, Queen of the Americas, these ads on the buses. And I'm saying, how many people really consider, Our Lady of Guadalupe, the Queen of America? I mean, it's a certain group of Christians who understand that. And in some ways, the level in which Hashem isn't recognized is astounding. And if one really does accept this notion of transcendency that I was trying to describe, then the level of unappreciation, is sort of being described when the Torah here uses the term carry, you know, that we're so blown away by our own advances in technology and other things like that, that we don't recognize that there is something way beyond that makes us possible, and to feel a sense of deep gratitude for that. So the Eloheinu has to do with the decision. So you start off with this understanding of what I'm so, trying to articulate, and saying, yeah, but if that's the truth, then what do I bring to this? And that is the performing of the mitzvot. And that is the part that is Eloheinu. So the term Eloheinu, in a way, is a shorthand for a person responding to Adonai and saying, this is what I need to do. This is what I need to devote my life to. And of course it involves, I'm saying it, but I don't feel I should have to, which is it involves incredible acts of chesed on our part, that to have kindness deeply embedded in our hearts, and to try not to take umbrage or to assume that umbrage is given in many situations, where there's a choice of responding in a calm and kind way, even though there may be some level of verbal abuse going on, but to really not, try to represent a divine presence of kindness and chesed in this world. And that covers a lot of territory and doesn't restrict people in terms of their, what they can accomplish personally in their lives. Because we're all different. We all have different talents, etc. But it's that kind of dynamic that, in a way, I feel what we're reading now is trying to somehow communicate the level of betrayal in not looking at it this way. And I know that we live in a culture that is so anthropocentric, right? And just doesn't ever think about the fact that there is something that makes all this possible, and that it's a reality.
But some people spend lots of time and effort thinking about that and considering that and don't come to an acceptance of the belief that it's true,
Yes.
and that there's a huge number of agnostics and atheists, and that doesn't mean they haven't all given any consideration to a transcendent God. It just means they weren't, at least as of yet, able to buy into that, and it's not what they believe, what they understand, what's in their hearts or minds. But that doesn't mean it's not in their hearts and minds at all. It just means that they have disbelief.
Yes, I
And
I want to.
and it's, and that doesn't mean they lack chesed,
Right, right. So
and it doesn't mean that they should endure such punishments.
I agree. But I think that, yes, I agree totally, because I think there are people who may not have been able to make that intellectual connection, but yet act lives of chesed. And I think that is still important. And I don't think these curses necessarily apply to that. At least I'd like to think that these curses do not apply to people who may, let's say, at least not articulate this, but nevertheless reflect it and act in that way of chesed, and try to actually represent, even though it's not consciously, a divine presence in this world.
Right, but maybe in terms of the chesed and the ethics, but not necessarily in terms of the
I,
chukot.
I understand. I understand. I understand. Right. I want to let Neshama speak because I know she's got her hand up. Neshama, and then David. Yeah.
I've always been curious how it is that given the intricacies and the of nature, um, how there's the interdependence of one species on the other, how the proboscis of this insect is the only insect that can pollinate flower because of the design of them, and that these are just very teeny examples uh, of how we are interconnected through God's design. And in, when people say they don't believe in God, I wonder if they've ever studied any of these things that give evidence for me that that we are divinely created, not just man woman kind, but our relationship with all of creation. uh, uh, so that's my question.
So can I answer that very briefly? Because I also want to let David speak. I think that they feel that's taken care of by survival of the fittest, that the theory of survival of the fittest really says, that's what made it possible. Whether that is really a satisfying answer, it that's another debate altogether, which isn't, we don't have time for that right now. But my understanding is that that's basically how they would say, that it isn't necessarily in the kind of way that we're describing, but it's more of a natural process. But again, it avoids the whole idea of the natural process itself being something that is built into this world and that requires something behind, something transcendent. David?
Yeah. So what I was going to say, going back to your point earlier, I also agree that as I get older, I have much more gratitude for and much more wonder, I'd say, for everything that goes around me or is around us, and that God has created. But I think along with that, the other part of that is that there's a feeling also of vast insignificance. I mean, the thing is, we'll never, as I grow older, I realize how much I don't comprehend about everything, and never ever will. And that feeling of insignificance, I think, is also something that it's hard to reconcile, and it's hard to again, and also the insignificance even with trying to perform mitzvot and acts of kindness. You cannot always see the benefits of those, and sometimes it actually turns around the other way, right? Someone performs an act of kindness and actually it turns the opposite direction. So we also have lots of examples of that too, and those are the things that I also have a very difficult time reconciling with this, because if we're here to perform those acts of kindness, you would hope that even at some individual level we would be able to see the benefit or results of those, and that's where I'm coming from on that. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
Right. No. I think it's a really good point. Okay. So again, and this is a little more difficult to accept, which is the notion that this is simply one part of an existence, that our appearance in this world is only a precursor of something later on after we pass out of this world. Now, that I think is in fact in the Bible. I think it explains all those laws to a great extent, the laws of purity and impurity. And the rabbis are quite explicit about it too. There's that wonderful statement in Pirkei Avot that says that this world can be compared to an antechamber, where you prepare yourself in the antechamber in order to enter the banquet hall, and that we're facing at least the potential of coming into a banquet hall when we're done with this particular life. But I also think that the narrative behind this is that we shouldn't look at this life, the purpose of this life, just to enjoy ourselves and to personally find pleasure, nothing but pleasure in this life, and that definition of a successful life is how much pleasure you have and what you've accomplished necessarily in terms of material goods and all those sorts of things, but rather in terms of chesed, the way in which you've left this world, even if it's in this in compared to the universe, insignificant kind of way. But, you individuals may be insignificant, but when we act as a community, there's less insignificance to it. And I don't think we should, undermine the part that we can play in bringing comfort to people's lives in the course of a lifetime. Most of us have a reasonable amount of time to try to accomplish this.
But studying interconnectivity, doing really wonderful work for humanity, and helping the situation of people around you before you die, and even understanding the limitations of science with no explanation of the beginning of matter doesn't necessarily lead to a version of God that is present, that set up a system as mitzvot, that punishes people who don't do them. I mean, it certainly points to something unknown at the beginnings, of origins of matter, but whatever, wherever that came from, is something that wants to punish us for, eating a pork chop is a different thing.
Right.
And so and I'm of course thinking about my dad, who didn't grow up at all kosher, wasn't allowed to eat pork in the house, but he did. I mean, that's the way he brought up, and that he didn't have a, feeling, but he did so much for humanity,
Right.
and is still in with his money and his name doing for people, and
Right.
especially indigent people and people with little means and little access to what the privileges he had. And
Right.
it's,
No. Mhm.
you know, you can't equate any of that with understanding naturally, oh, this means there is a God, this kind of connectivity of biology and physical sciences and all that means that you can't do that. That's where faith comes in. But not everybody has faith. That's a subset of humanity.
Yes, I
I
agree.
think, oh,
Go
I
on.
And
think,
not everybody who lacks faith doesn't, there are many amongst those are people who spend time studying Torah and praying and doing other things that, are a contemplation and meditation of what might be.
I believe what Lawrence says about technology and science. The Darwin theory of evolution is science. Technology also interferes with the praying to God. People are just all technology and they forget about God. And I think that's what Lauren's talking about too. I believe on her
No,
what she
no,
said.
technology can bring people to God. I mean, that's just a tool
No, I,
for
I don't I
good
don't
or
think
bad.
Lauren, I think the point that Lauren is making is that there are people who really are wonderful, who really contribute tremendously to society, but don't necessarily pray or believe in God or things like that.
Ah,
And
okay.
I would agree
Or
with
believe in God in the way that traditional Judaism would have us
right.
understand.
Right. I can't argue with that. I myself agree with you. I think there are many people who do not practice mitzvot like Shabbat or Kashrut or those hukim, right? But nevertheless do an amazing job of trying to bring help to society. Look, ultimately, God is the true judge. We know that. And that I have to assume that God is able to balance these sorts of things. And so trying to bring this back to what we're looking at here, and again, using the Torah, understanding the Torah as a literary piece, is that it's using a certain level. I don't think I think it's only a certain level of hyperbole, you know, that maybe some things that we don't think are that important, the Torah is saying are actually very important, and we need to at least give that consideration. I don't, hopefully, I don't try to come across, with a big club, to sort of club people into belief and stuff like that. I think that's a terrible, terrible approach. But on the other hand, just to try and raise consciousness and say, just because we don't think it's important doesn't mean it isn't important. And I
But
think
this portion is all about reward and punishment, and that is debatable as a working system.
I'm not arguing with you. Look, on a certain level, it didn't, right? I mean, we may understand it as prophetic, right? Because of what history has shown us happened to the Jewish people. But on the other hand, if it's supposed to work as a motivating piece, which I think it is. I mean, I like to look at it more in that regard than saying, although I think there is legitimacy to saying there are consequences, and there may be dire consequences if we don't take these things seriously in terms of our morality and how we treat others, et cetera, or how we choose to live our lives. But I think your dad, Lauren, is a wonderful example of someone who wasn't outwardly religious, or necessarily practicing prayer and things like that, or other mitzvot, and yet made many sacrifices and really was a very courageous person in that regard. So maybe we are left with trying to understand what it means by going with God and using that Hebrew word carry, right? That what exactly does that take into account in terms of how people behave, right? And whether or not carry has more to do with just selfishness and self-centeredness and not having consideration. Yes, David, and then we're going to have to quit. Yes.
Yeah. So the one other thing, just to kind of, I went to a lecture yesterday. It was on the Anne Frank Association of America, and one of the things that they brought up, which I found to be interesting and also very frightening, is the fact that there are only 15 million Jews left worldwide. And I mean left in the sense that if you look at us compared to the rest of the world's population, we're now become a very, 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 very small and maybe insignificant, portion of that. So then you have to wonder, like you said, has the system worked or has the system failed, right? And that's kind of, it was very, once that stat came up, I was, it kind of shook me a bit. So I think this also talks about that. I mean, or speaks to that, right? Because then the question is, do we really need to follow everything in order to ward off becoming insignificant or disappearing or not? And I don't know, it feels like you said, maybe it's prophetic and we haven't achieved that. So I don't know. It's just very disconcerting.
Right.
I'll
Well,
leave it. I'm sorry that was just, after that and going through today's discussion, it just feels like we're not going in the right direction.
well,
I
yeah, go
won't
ahead.
be here next week, by the way.
Okay.
Oh,
Let me
hopefully.
stop. Why don't I stop the recording? Okay, let me stop the recording.